Myself and Claire are going to chat to you a little bit about biodiversity in Ireland, and we've kind of picked four key themes that we'll chat through, looking at how we can all help with caring for biodiversity and things that we maybe need to be thinking about or aware of as we try to encourage biodiversity at our homes or on our school campuses or in our community green spaces. So those four key things are, we'll look at habitat continuity throughout the year, habitat continuity in space, so physically, like around us, and then the importance of wild corners in our managed landscapes. And we look also at what items or products that we may be using that inadvertently or by accident, without us realizing it, cause harm to wildlife. So I'm going to play you a short video now. It's from the World Wildlife Fund, and it's has David Attenborough, who I'm sure everybody is very familiar with his wonderful voice and his wonderful way of explaining to us about the wonders of nature. So it's a short video on what is biodiversity.
Biodiversity is a term that represents the total variety of all life on Earth. That's a big thing to sum up. Thousands of different wild habitats, millions of different species, billions of different individuals, and the trillions of different characteristics they all have. The total biodiversity of our planet is immense. Which is a good thing, because the more biodiversity, the more secure all life on Earth is, including ourselves. Only when life is at its most varied, vigorous, biodiverse, can we hope to thrive. We may not know it, but we need towering forests across 1/3 of the land surface to lock away carbon and keep the climate stable. We need millions of pollinators and billions of soil organisms and megatons of plankton to keep the food we eat in supply. We need strange plants deep in jungles to create our medicines, and coral reefs and mangrove swamps to protect the coasts we depend upon. Our planet's biodiversity provides all the things we need for free. But it will only do so if there's lots of it, and at the moment it's under attack. In the last 50 years, our activities have dramatically reduced biodiversity across the globe. We've snuffed out habitats, reduced populations of wild animals by 60%, and even driven whole species extinct. The number of lions in Africa has dropped by 65%. The number of individual flying insects in Europe has dropped by 75%. The number of bluefin tuna in the Pacific has dropped by 95%. Biodiversity is dropping everywhere and fast. This is catastrophic for nature and therefore ourselves. We talk about climate change a lot, but biodiversity loss is as important an issue. How do we stop this loss of life? How do we ensure that biodiversity, our planet's vital statistic, begins to increase again? In fact, we already know exactly what to do.
So as David Attenborough says at the end there, we do know exactly what to do. And you guys are already playing a part in that. So within Ireland, the responsibility for looking after nature and looking after biodiversity falls on all of us. But it is also written into Irish law. And because we're in Ireland, we're part of the European Union, or the EU. And there too, we have quite strong laws looking to protect the natural world. We've also signed up to international agreements with the United Nations, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute, and I'm sure you're familiar with some of that work. And then, of course, we all can take responsibility ourselves, which is what you guys are doing by being a green school and by working on the biodiversity theme in your schools, but also at home, and of course in your green community spaces and other areas where you own or have access to land that you can make a positive impact on. So I'll talk about each of those very, very briefly and quickly. But within Ireland, we have protection for biodiversity written into our laws. And the main law for protecting biodiversity would be the Wildlife Act. And that's been in place in Ireland for a long time now, since 1976. And through that, we have picked out special areas that have wonderful natural heritage, that is natural areas that are really important for protecting, and they're unique and they have a lot of biodiversity. So we know we have these special areas that we already manage and try to protect as best as possible. The Wildlife Act also covers things like licenses. So for, say, for hunting or for ringing and tagging, you know, if you're doing research, you might want to put little tags on seals or rings on identification rings on birds' legs, so we can understand and investigate where these animals are moving to and so on. So you need a license for those kind of things, and that's all carried out under law, under legislation. Protecting wild birds, controlling the import and export of plants and animals, of course, and there's so many other things that key piece of legislation or big law of the Wildlife Act covers in Ireland. Also, within Europe, there are some really strong laws protecting habitats, so big areas that are unique, where animals and plants live and thrive. So those habitats, many habitats in Ireland are protected because they're special habitats, such as some of the peatlands and rivers, lakes and waterways. And then there's also the Habitats Directive, and then there's also the Birds Directive. And through these two directives, we have certain areas that are considered very special. So the Habitats Directive has picked out lots of special areas of conservation, SACs, and the Birds Directive, we look at areas where birds either nest or feed, important areas for feeding or nesting or breeding, and those areas are called Special Protected Areas. They're called SPAs. Now, you probably hear about these actually in the news sometimes. These are the things that often would come up as news items if there's any problems in those particular areas that have been, if there's been damage or if there's been birds breeding or whatever, you'd hear positive or negative sometimes news items about those. So Ireland has signed up to those laws as well, and they have been written into our own Irish laws, making them legal or illegal, different things around those in Ireland. So the one other thing around our signing up to the European Union laws is that we must undertake regular national assessments on the conservation status of habitats and species in the directives. And that's really similar to your monitoring and evaluation, say, in your school grounds. So we have to, as part of the EU law, we in Ireland have to check in with all our different areas and check, say, how many birds are there or how many fish are breeding in that particular lake. We have to do these assessments on a regular basis to make sure that we're looking after our special areas of conservation and special protected areas. So then also, I suppose, on an international, global, looking at the whole world, we can take responsibility together. And this is done really under the United Nations. So the United Nations is a very large group of countries who've come together. So 193 different countries around the world who've come together, and I suppose they're like friends. They're trying to work together and problem solve together and help each other to solve problems maybe that are global problems, not just small local problems. Big problems like air pollution or say like diseases. You know, we saw the United Nations did an awful lot of communication around COVID-19, for example. And now they're doing an awful lot of work on climate change. And you're probably familiar with some of their work through the global goals. So the United Nations oversees the global goals. And obviously within that, then we have a lot of responsibilities around biodiversity. So the UN set up what's called the CBD, or the Convention of Biological Diversity, in 1992. And Ireland has been signed up to that since 1996. And Ireland has played a really important role, especially in 2015, helping to discuss and decide what the 17 Sustainable Development Goals would be. And obviously within them then, as I said, we have some key goals of the overall global goals that look very specifically at biodiversity. And as part of our obligations, or what we have to do to continue our work and help with the Convention of Biological Diversity, we and all countries who've signed up to it have to write an action plan, a biodiversity action plan for their country. So we get to do it for our schools, and you get to do it for your school, you know? So it's the exact same thing. It's like an assessment overall of where biodiversity is in Ireland. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Are some species doing really well? Which species are maybe not doing so well? And so they do that not just in their school campus, but across the whole country. It's quite a big piece of work. And did you know that your work as Green Schools is actually reported on in this National Biodiversity Action Plan, but under the education and awareness raising section? So the work that you're doing feeds into that whole global picture. And those images that you saw with David Attenborough was discussing there, all of your work feeds right back up into that level, looking after biodiversity on the planet. So keep it up and well done. And unfortunately, here in Ireland, we do have a lot of problems with biodiversity, as we see across the whole world. And the main threats and pressures that have been listed as being the key problems for biodiversity in Ireland over the last number of years would be agriculture, forestry and fisheries, natural system modifications such as drainage, mining and quarrying. Climate change is a big problem. Things are changing very quickly in terms of the regular temperatures and extremes of weather coming in. So that's a problem. Pollution is another one. Invasive and problematic species. And then habitat loss. So removing just good quality habitat is also still happening in places, and it's an ongoing pressure. So what we're going to do now is look at ways of how we can approach a really effective change, and what things we need to consider, how nature works and how we can work with nature to understand it better and therefore help it better when we go about making action or taking action on our school grounds. So Claire is going to look at habitat continuity throughout the year and give you habitat continuity on the ground as well, and give some lovely Irish examples of how that works and where that works. So I'll hand over to Claire now, and I'll chat to you again in a few minutes.
Great. So guys, I know some of you joined a bit late, so I'll just say again, may have mentioned at the beginning, if anybody wants to answer or ask any questions, you can pop it in the chat box. So I'm going to be asking you a few bits as I go along, so feel free to have somebody, maybe your teacher at the top of the class, who can answer any of my questions if you know them. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about two of the examples Maeve mentioned there. And the example we're going to talk about first is the connection between bees and plants, and how they need kind of a constant supply of habitats throughout the year. So continuity in habitats across time. So you'll understand what I mean by that as we go along. So you all know that bees and plants depend on each other. I'm just going to explain a bit more about that first of all, so it's clear to you. And then we'll talk about how important timing is and how everything needs to be linked together throughout the year, and how delicate a balance it is. So first of all, what exactly is pollination? I think we hear that word all the time, but maybe you're not exactly sure what it means. So pollination is when pollen is moved from one plant to another. So pollen is something sort of like a yellow dusty stuff, and it gets moved from the male part of the flower to the female part of a different flower. So you can see in this diagram here, it's a picture of what the inside of a flower looks like. And all flowers will look slightly different, all plants will look slightly different, but they will all have these same parts to them. So you can see, you might not think of plants as being male and female, but there are male and female parts in plants. And the male part of the plants includes something called the anther, and the anthers contain the pollen. So the pollen is this stuff that we're talking about for allowing pollination to happen. And the pollen needs to get from a male anther to the female stigma. So you can see in the picture, the stigma looks a bit kind of like the opening of a vase, and the pollen, this kind of dusty stuff, has to get into that. And when that happens, it can form a new seed and fruit. So all plants grow from seeds, and they can only make new seeds once pollination happens. And obviously, this dust can't just get up and walk over to a new flower. So it needs something to help it get it there. And that's what pollination is. It's the movement of that pollen from one flower to another. So it's not just moving from the anther, the yellow bit, into the top stigma, the base of the same flower. It has to get to a different one altogether. And that's the process of pollination. So it happens differently depending on what kind of plant it is and in what country it is. So there's lots of different things which can move pollen. Can anybody know what this bird here is in the top left-hand corner? You can pop it into the chat if you know. So there are some countries where you will get birds helping to pollinate flowers. We don't really get that in Ireland, but in other countries you will get generally small birds doing it. And yet you guys are right, it's a hummingbird. So you can see it has this really long and pointed beak, so it's able to get right into the flowers to where the pollen is, and it's usually looking for nectar. So plants have kind of this great, it's not really a trick, but it's something that helps them to get animals to come in and have this lovely sweet nectar. So it tastes really good, it gives them lots of energy. And while they are collecting nectar, a lot of times what happens is the pollen will stick to them and they will then move that to another plant. So like I said, not in Ireland, but in other countries, you'll get birds like hummingbirds and even bats. You can see bats there in the bottom left-hand corner. They are also pollinators in some countries. The bats in Ireland aren't pollinators, and they don't feed on nectar. Does anybody know what Irish bats generally eat? There's another group that they are more focused on. Pop it in the chat box if you think you know. It's kind of might be a bit tricky, and I'll give you guys a sec to think about it. Yeah, I've got a lot of right answers there. Yeah, so insects, bugs. So Irish and bats, that's what their main diet is. And what's more common for us in Ireland in terms of our pollinators are insects. So it's mostly bees. You also get butterflies, moths, flies, and these insects are moving pollen from one plant to the next. You can see the bee, you can see the pollen is stuck to it, to its little hairs. And then the picture on the right is to give you the idea of wind. So some plants, pollination occurs by the wind blowing it. And this is a bit more reliant on chance, because the wind could blow the pollen anywhere. Whereas we know that these animals are going to be landing on another plant in a minute to get more food. So they're a bit more reliable in terms of where they're going to move it. And hopefully that yellow pollen will drop off. Okay. So like I said, in Ireland, we rely on insects as our pollinators, and bees are the most important pollinator in Ireland. So they move the majority of pollen. And they are kind of specially adapted to doing this because bees actually have special areas and hairs covering their legs just for picking up pollen. And the reason for that is bees will collect pollen and then they'll kind of form it into like a special ball, and they feed that to their larvae or young bees. So they bring it back for the young bees. And the adults, they're mostly trying to feed on the nectar. So I mentioned earlier, nectar is also inside the flower. And while they're collecting the nectar, they're getting pollen at the same time. And it gets stuck to all of their different hairs. So they're really good at it, whereas other insects, which are not hairy, they won't get as much pollen stuck to them as bees do. And then when the bee goes on to the next flower to get some more nectar, some of the pollen that they've collected will fall off. It will land on the stigma, the female stigma, and then pollination occurs and it can create a new seed and fruit for a new flower to grow. So that's the basics of pollination in terms of what it is and what's actually happening. And now we'll just talk a bit about the importance of timing and needing to have habitats kind of all year long that suit the bees and the pollinators. So this is the life cycle of a bumblebee, and I'll kind of go through it and show you how they need different amounts of food and things at different times of the year. So if we'll start off at the top here in bold in springtime, and spring is when you see usually bees for the first time. So the queen bees will come out of hibernation when the weather is starting to improve, usually February at the earliest. And as soon as that happens, she needs to begin feeding. So there has to be flowers available for her at this time, where she isn't going to be able to survive and then have her young. So if that doesn't happen, there's not going to be any new bees that year. So what she's going to do straight away in spring is begin searching for food, so flowers which are out early. And if you think back to, February, there's not as many flowers as there are at the moment. So it's really important that we do have enough plants and suitable habitats for her in spring, because if not, we're not going to get the rest of this life cycle happening. So it's important for there to be flowering plants available in February. So things like dandelions are usually out early, willow and hazel, these trees will have early flowers. They're really important at this time of the year. And then she's also searching for a good nest site, somewhere to have the worker bees, the larvae, the young. So she begins then collecting nectar for herself and also pollen for the young bees. And so she lays her eggs. And when the worker bumblebees hatch, at first they're all female. So we always start off with female worker bees, and they're the ones that do all of the hard work of looking after the next round of eggs, and they are the ones that are out collecting lots of food. So now that we have more bees out, we also need more flowers because there's more bees to feed. So we need to increase the amount of plants and life we have available here. So you could have the colony growing and growing over the summer. The queen keeps on laying more eggs. She doesn't just lay them once, and still continuing to produce mostly females. And then in later summer, so this is when we need the most food available, is in late summer, because we have the most bees out. So they need tons of food then. And this is when males appear. So they will then breed with new queens, which are the only ones that are going to survive in winter. So they're going to hibernate in winter. So we don't necessarily need food for them here. We just need the right types of habitats. They need somewhere to hibernate. So you can see here, I went through it pretty quickly, but depending on whether it's spring, summer, autumn, or winter, we need different amounts of food or different types of habitats for the bees to survive. And it's not just the bees that are relying on the plants. The plants are also relying on the bees, like we said, to move the pollen. So bees need constant supply of food from spring through to late autumn. And there's going to be different plants that are in bloom or flowering at different times of the year. And that's really important for the bees. And they also need to have types of plants where they can get at the pollen and the nectar. So some plants have flowers which are better for bees than others. They have to be able to get in and get at that pollen and nectar. And then even when they don't need food in wintertime, they still need suitable habitats. And then what do plants need? So plants are also relying on the bees so that they can move the pollen from one plant to another. Otherwise, there's not going to be new plants next year. And if there's not new plants next year, the bees aren't going to have any food to eat next year. So they're really well connected. And it's also important for the plants to avoid competition. So if you imagine if there was thousands of plants growing in your garden or on your school grounds, and there was only 10 bees, most of those plants mightn't get pollinated because there's too many of them and not enough bees. So the bees might only pollinate a few of them, not have time to do the rest. So it's actually really helpful for plants to flower at different times of the year. So if some flower in spring, some come into flower in summer, and some come into flower in autumn, that means that all of them will have a chance to be pollinated by the bees because they have spread it out and they're giving themselves a chance for the bees to come and to feed from them and to spread the pollen. So it's really a delicate kind of fine balance, and you can see how connected they both are. So I'll just give you a few examples of what might happen. But have a think about this. What do you think would happen if one year the bees came out much later in spring than they usually did? So the flowers come out at the normal time, but there's no bees then. Let's say the bees are late to come out of hibernation. It's colder that year for some reason, and the bees don't come out. What do you think would happen, or what wouldn't happen to the flowers? Does anybody have an idea that they want to give? And this can happen, especially at the moment with climate change occurring. Things seem are a bit more complicated. Animals are coming out later or earlier. Yeah, great. So the flowers wouldn't necessarily get pollinated. So the flowers that were out in spring wouldn't be pollinated. Very good, guys. So it would just be the plants which flower in early spring that would be affected in that time. And what about if the kind of the opposite happened? If the bees came out at the normal time in early spring, let's say in February, but there was no flowering plants available, if they emerged later in spring than usual, how would that affect things? What do you think might happen then? You want just coming in? Yeah, there'd be no food for those bees. And if there was no food for the bees in spring, are the bees going to survive to the summer? They're not, because the queen bees are the ones which are going to lay the eggs for all the future bees. So, whoops. Yeah, so the queen bees wouldn't have enough food to feed themselves or their larvae. And then last one, what about if all of the flowering plants emerge at the same time in spring? So rather than some come out in spring, some come out in summer, some come out in autumn, what would happen if they all emerged at the exact same time in spring? And you also have your queen bees coming out in spring, but there's no worker bees yet. Do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing? Or how would that affect things? This is a bit more of a tricky one. Got a few answers coming in. Yeah, not all would be pollinated. Very good. And yeah, there wouldn't be, that's a great answer. There wouldn't be sustained food to keep the bees alive all year. Very good. So there would be loads of food in spring for the queen bees, and then they would be able to feed their larvae. But then once all of they emerged in summer, there wouldn't be food. And also, like you said, the flowers wouldn't be pollinated. So those are just 3 examples of what can happen in spring. I could have done 10 more questions about what if things were different in summer or autumn or winter. So you can see that having everything timed correctly is really, really important and really tricky. And this is why, well, one reason why climate change is so difficult and complicated, because it can affect when bees emerge and when plants begin to grow and so on. So if you want to find out a bit more about bees and pollination, there's some cool videos for International Bee Day, which was just a couple of days ago. And there's the Junior Pollinator Plan and some really good information on what plants are best at different times of the year. And I'm going to put this PowerPoint into the chat box at the end so you can have a look at those links. And then the second example I want to talk to you guys about is continuity in space, which I may have mentioned. So the idea of this is that it's not just in one area that you need to look after biodiversity, that it's connected throughout the world. So the biodiversity we have in Ireland is linked to plants and animals and decisions people make and climate and geography in other countries worldwide. And this is in lots of different ways. We're going to look at the example of migration, and specifically the migration of this particular bird. I almost gave you the name. Does anybody recognize this bird from the picture? It's arrived in Ireland recently. It spends summer in Ireland and in other countries around Europe, and then it spends its winter in Africa. It's kind of a difficult one. It looks quite like another bird. So we have a few different answers here. Somebody got it right. So this is a swift. So it looks quite similar to a swallow. There's a slightly different length of its forked tail. So I'll show you what it looks like in color. So this is the swift, and its name is really descriptive. So swifts are really fast birds. Its Irish name means wind catcher. So it kind of looks like they're just swooping up in the wind. They can almost look like they can almost float on it. And its name in German means wall glider, because swifts, you will never see them, sitting on a tree branch or walking on the ground. Their feet aren't adapted to do that, but they can kind of move along a wall. Looks kind of interesting. And they're a really interesting bird. I'll try not to talk about them for too long, because we might be a bit short on time, but they're really fascinating. So I'll just give you a few facts about them. They're amazing flyers. So most of their lives are spent in flight. So they eat, they sleep, they drink, they do everything in the air. So except their feet just aren't suited to being kind of sitting on a branch like you might see other birds doing. They will nest. So when they're nesting, they're not flying, obviously. But apart from that, they are generally in flight. And they are like bats. They feed on flying insects. They're really, really well adapted to catching them. So they're able to control themselves really well and fight to grab them. And they can tell insects apart really well in terms of what insects can sting and what ones can't. So they're really smart birds. And they're really fast. So they are one of the fastest birds in the world when they're flying on the level. So on the level means like in a, kind of straight across. So not flying up or not diving down. So a bird like a peregrine falcon is faster than a swift when it's in a dive. But if they were doing a race, where they had to go from one point to the other, kind of right to left, swift would be quicker. And they're also very loud. So I'll see if I can play you what they sound like. It's kind of a screeching sound, and you might notice this when they're flying or when they are arguing over who's going to use what nest site. So they have a really good way as well of drinking water. It's amazing. So they can catch it whilst flying. I'll just show you a couple of seconds of this.
Swifts can be reckoned as one of the most capable birds on the wing. Eating tiny flying insects as a diet, their control and agility is almost unmatched by any other birds. It is no wonder though, since most of their lives takes place on the wing, and they are equipped for such incredible flying. Drinking water is yet another challenge to which they have a masterful solution. The whole group is now here for a drink, and they repeatedly swoop down. It may look rather easy, but it takes many tries before they can successfully swoop down millimeters above the water and elegantly scoop up a mouthful.
So pretty amazing way of drinking water. They're also able to catch raindrops. So when it's raining, they can catch rainwater. So that was just a bit of background on the swift. So what I really want to use them as an example for is how connected they are to lots of different places, and how it's important different stages of their lives to have the right kind of food and habitats and water and safety in so many different places around the planet. So the red lines that I have on the map here show the swift migration. So they spend the winter months, or what's winter months to us, in the southern half of Africa. So they might be in several different places in southern Africa. And then when they migrate up to Europe in summer, in about March, they will go northwest. So they kind of, no matter where they start, they will go all the way to the west of Africa and then go north. And what they're doing here is they're avoiding flying over the Sahara as much as they can, because there's obviously not much food or water there. So they go as west as they can, and then they go north up through Spain or Portugal, and then they can split off either towards Ireland or the UK or even France or Germany. So they could end up in lots of different places in Europe. And then this purple line here is just a different kind of migration corridor that a lot of birds use. So the swifts don't, but there's tons of other birds which go up through Eastern Africa and then through the Middle East. And then they separate off into different directions, either into Asia or Eastern Europe. So a lot of birds go huge distances when they migrate, and they need different things in different countries. So just talk quickly about the life cycle of a swift and what they need when. So in March and April, this is when they make their journey. And, they're taking in, 10, 15 different countries during this time. And what they need from these countries is a safe passage. So some countries will have laws which protect migrating birds from hunting. So Maeve mentioned earlier that Ireland has signed up to some international laws and agreements, and that's the same in other countries throughout the world. But not all countries do sign up, so which makes it difficult, because it's really important to have that continuity, to have everybody on the same page. And they also need safe weather. So if there's bad storms or something, they can get blown off course, or they might not survive the journey. And they also need food to refuel. So different birds will stop a different number of times. Some can go for longer than others. They'll generally need to refuel somewhere. And then when swifts arrive in Ireland or whatever country they're arriving to, they will go back to the exact same nest spot that they were in last year, and they will meet back up with the same partner they had last year. So they might not have, they won't have seen them for months, and they will both meet back up in the same nest. So they mate for life. They have the same partners for life. They try and use the same nest for life. So once they're 4 years old, that's when they start to breed and to lay eggs. So another thing that birds need when they migrate is nest sites. And swifts have actually changed the type of nest sites they used because of humans. So the nest sites they used to use are not as available, and now they usually use old buildings. So you might find them in sheds and barns under the eaves. So it's important that they have suitable sites for nests. And then the female will lay 2 or 3 eggs at a time, with maybe a day or so in between them. And both the mother and father will look after them, keep them warm, incubate them. And then once the eggs hatch, the parents will bring back insects for them to feed on. So it's important for them to have a good food supply once this has happened. So they need food once they arrived, because they'll have spent a lot of energy on the journey. They'll need a lot of food once they've laid their eggs. And like I said, they feed on insects, and insects generally are only plentiful at a certain time of the year. In summer, you see more and more flying insects. So it's really important that those insects are available. And then once the chicks are able to fly, they will return quite quickly to southern Africa for the warmer winter over there. And again, they make the same journey back, where they need safe passage. And once they get back to southern Africa, they need to be able to have enough food The insects that they feed on rely on having wet areas. So they kind of tend to follow the rains in Southern Africa. So they need the right habitats there, they need the right amount of food, and they need the right amount of water. So it's quite a lot of things that they need throughout the course of their life in quite a lot of different places. So if you think, maybe some of you have put up Swift boxes before, which is really helpful for them here. And we think, oh, that's great, we've helped the Swifts, and we have. But we also need to think about, are they going to survive the journey back? Are they going to survive when they are spending their winter period in Africa? So what do swifts and other migrating birds need? So they need different things at different times of the year, like we've talked about. During the nesting season, they need a good site to build their nest, they need material to build it, food and water, and they need it at the exact right times. And then during the winter season, they need suitable habitats, food and water supply. And then when they're migrating, they need safe passage, good weather, and places to stop and refuel. So it's quite a lot of things that is needed. And this, that is not just for swifts, it's for so many migrating animals, not just birds migrate, lots of others do as well. So if you want to get more information here, you can learn about the different migration routes that birds take, more about the swifts, or there's a nice video here to see larger migrating birds like swans and geese up close. It's a really nice one. Okay, guys, so that's all from me. So I'm going to hand you back over now to Maeve, and she'll take you to 2 more examples. And then if you have any questions at the end, we can come back to them.
And let's see. Okay, so yeah, so Claire spoke there about the continuity in habitat throughout the year and also in physical space throughout the year, or throughout space, sorry, habitat throughout space. So the next couple of things that I will talk about are wild corners in managed landscapes, and then also products that we use that may inadvertently cause harm to wildlife. So we'll start with the importance of wild corners in our managed landscape. So it's really important, obviously, that we can do whatever we can in whatever spaces we can to help biodiversity. But the best thing that we can do is not create loads of flower beds or plant pots. Like they can help, of course they can help. But the best thing to do is let areas go wild. And this is because when we do that, not only are there lots of different species that will grow there that we'd never have the ability to plant as many or to create that kind of complex habitat, but also it gets really interesting in terms of structure. So you have all these trees that grow straight and have leaves at the top, but then you have things like ivy and bramble that wrap around and cover up and create very safe little nooks and crannies for small insect birds and small mammals and that to hide in and to have space. So having an area go wild is probably the best thing we could possibly do, especially in small green spaces. So if we can, that is a really good thing to do, and I'll talk about why. So the structure, as I say, the structural diversity, so that means that it can get really complicated. It's not just grass or it's not just flowers growing straight and creating lovely colorful beds. It can be flowers, but also you'll get fruit growing, you'll get thorny bushes that come, and they are really good for protecting small birds. Small birds can go and hide in there from big predators like foxes or big hunting birds like say buzzards. So they can have the small songbirds like say the wren or the robin can find tiny little holes in there to make a nest, and those nests then the eggs can't be stolen, say by magpies or hooded crows or ravens, which love doing that normally. They can't get into these little nooks and crannies in this dense natural growth. So that's a really positive thing that we can do. And they can be used also for roost. So we even get bats hibernating in dense hedges under ivy and that throughout the winter as well. So it's really, really good for cover for lots of different reasons. And then each species in that kind of wild area offers additional benefits beyond structure. So obviously bramble can provide the extra protection with thorns, but beyond that then, it's a really resilient, it happens to be a really resilient plant. So it doesn't need to drop seeds to grow necessarily. If a bramble branch touches the ground, it can actually put roots down there again and grow on further from there. And it's the same with ivy. So they're really incredibly strong and resilient plants. So that's another feature of them. But also they provide in the spring, bramble would provide lots of flowers full of nectar for pollinators and flies and bees and butterflies, as mentioned already. And then in the autumn, which this picture was taken in the autumn, as you can see, there's fruit on the bushes. So it provides an abundance of fruit for lots and lots of different animals in the environment. So there's a really amazing importance to these wild places that you could never really do or create by just putting a flower bed in. So the ivy is another really strong example that I've already mentioned, and it's the same principle, I suppose, with the how it clings to rocks and walls, and it can carpet the ground under shady areas like under a hedge. So it's really important for the structure to create those little spaces for small birds and small rodents to hide and be safe. But also ivy, the really interesting thing about ivy is that in the autumn is when it flowers, which is quite unique. So that's touching back to what Claire was saying, getting the year-round supply of food is really important. So the autumn is when the nectar comes, and then in the springtime, at this time of year, late spring into summer, you have the fruit being available. And again, it's a really important fuel for birds and mammals this time of year, and that's really, really helpful. Then we look also at the importance of wild corners in terms of the diversity of plants. So you get all along road verges and roadside, the edges of fields and field margins, other plants occur naturally. Now we'd probably call them weeds, but what is a weed? Only a plant that we didn't put there. So it's just nature's flowers. That's all a weed really is. And they're really important for lots of different reasons. And sometimes we don't maybe appreciate or fully understand the reasons. But one example that's just gone out of bloom now, but would still be standing with seed pods all around the road verges, would be something called garlic mustard. It's also called Jack by the hedge. And this is one of the food plants of the orange-tipped butterfly. Now, the orange-tipped butterfly lays its eggs on these plants and just one or two other species, but it can't lay its eggs anywhere. It has to lay them on these kind of species. And the eggs get laid on these leaves, and when the little caterpillars hatch out, that's the food they're going to eat. So if the butterflies laid the eggs on other plants that weren't suitable, the caterpillars wouldn't be able to eat the leaves of other plants. They love these ones and a couple of others. Another example is lady smock. So again, the orange-tipped butterfly loves to lay their eggs on these plants. So their butterflies are quite limited in what food their babies, their caterpillars, are going to eat. So these all grow wild and they're really important. Nettles, you've probably heard that nettles are really important for caterpillars. Now, not all caterpillars, but for a good few species, such as the tortoiseshell. You can see the caterpillars there of the tortoiseshell in the video. The tortoiseshell butterflies are the butterflies, there's 3 of them on thistles there right beside the video. The butterfly in the middle there is a red admiral. It's black with a red line and white spots. And then another species that lays eggs on the nettle and needs a nettle to lay its eggs on is a moth species called the burnished brass, and that's the picture on the left hand side there. So nettles, although we mightn't love them because obviously they sting us, they are the food plant for these creatures. So if they don't have that plant available, they cannot complete their life cycle, and the species will go extinct locally in your area if that kind of food isn't available for them. And then grasses, we often overlook grasses, but actually grasses are the food plant for lots of caterpillars, for other butterfly species. Many of them are brown species. I suppose maybe for camouflage reasons, the brown ones lay their eggs on browning older grass. So we have meadow brown, which is in the picture. There's the ringlet butterfly, speckled wood, and wall. All of those butterfly species are in Ireland, and they lay their eggs on the grasses, and the grass is the food plant of the caterpillars. It's the only food that the caterpillars can eat. So the grasses are really important for biodiversity as well. So just leaving that wild verge at the edge of the field is so critical. Now, the last thing I was due to speak about, but I see we've gotten kind of to the end of the hour. Unfortunately, we had those technical issues at the start. The last thing I was going to speak briefly about, but same as Claire, I've put the links to videos and content at the end of this PowerPoint presentation, which we'll share as a PDF. So plastics in our environment are really hazardous and can be very damaging to wildlife. So there's a video there you can watch about that. There is a video here about organic growing, and again I'll put the link into the PDF. And the very last one, which I really hope if you're to watch any of them, this would be my go-to video to watch. It's about 5 minutes long, and it looks at the impact of rodenticide. So that's the poisons we put out to kill rats and mice. How that impacts on our kestrels, our barn owls, and other bird species up the food chain. So if you have time to watch one more video today, I'd suggest this one. And unfortunately, we have, as I say, run out of time. So sample actions from today. I hope you've been inspired. I hope you've learned some really nice new bits of information that have fascinated you. But sample actions from each of the themes that we talked about is have pollinator-friendly flowers in bloom for as much of the year as possible, if you can figure that out on your school grounds. Another option might be to investigate swift nest boxes. Another option might be to leave wild spaces, if you can, in your school grounds or local community areas. Let nature take care of itself. And the last sample action might be to speak to board of management, caretakers, or facilities management in relation to the use of wildlife harming products. See if you use rodenticide and see if there's other ways of working around it. And as I said, the links will be sent to you by PDF afterwards.